Open your Maps app right now. Doesn't matter which one. Find Australia, zoom in on the center, that vast rust-colored interior, and just drag. Keep going. Hundreds of kilometers, maybe more. And you'll notice something that no other continent on Earth shows you quite so clearly. Nothing. Not mountains. Not rivers. Not even a single road. Just blank space, stretching in every direction like the map itself gave up trying. But here's the thing. That's not nothing. That's a choice. Maps don't show you the world as it is. They show you the world as someone decided it should be seen. And Australia, more than anywhere else, makes that gap between those two things brutally obvious. Because out there, beyond the edges of what's been named and drawn and uploaded and tagged, there are places, real places, places with history, with weight, with stories that don't fit neatly onto a pin. Some were forgotten, some were left behind when the money ran out, and some, and this is the part that stays with you, some were deliberately removed, erased, decided out of existence by the people who draw the lines. This is a countdown of the 10 most invisible places in Australia. Not the most remote, not just the most desolate. The most invisible, the places that exist, have always existed, but that the map decided weren't worth seeing. By the end of this, you won't look at a blank space the same way again. Start with scale. Because before you can understand what Australia hides, you have to understand how much space it has to hide things in. The Great Victoria Desert covers roughly 420,000 square kilometers. That's larger than Germany, larger than Japan, larger than most countries that have seats at the United Nations. And if you look at it on any digital map, what you'll find is essentially nothing. No named features, no roads, no markers of any kind. Just a vast expanse of color that the map treats as background. But it's not background. It's land. Old land. The kind of old that makes European history feel like a recent development. The desert is crossed by ancient songlines, Aboriginal navigational and spiritual routes that predate any written map by tens of thousands of years. Jukurpa, the Anangu call it, the law of the land. Directions embedded not in roads or coordinates, but in stories, in landforms, in the memory carried by people who've walked this country since before the concept of a country existed. None of that is on the map. What the map shows is absence. What's actually there is one of the oldest continuously inhabited landscapes on the planet. That tension between what the map shows and what's actually there is the thread that runs through everything that follows. There's a particular kind of grief attached to places that were built on hope and killed by reality. Farina was founded in 1878, deep in the arid north of South Australia, during a period when colonial planners genuinely believed the interior could be farmed. The thinking went something like, it rains in England, it'll rain here eventually. Build it and the rain will follow. They called it farina, Latin for flour, because they were certain this would be wheat country one day. It wasn't. The rains didn't come. Or when they did, they came wrong. Too much at once, then nothing for years. The settlers tried. They really did. At its peak, Farina had a hotel, a bakery, a post office, a cordial factory. Children grew up here. People got married here. A whole social world existed in this sun-cracked stretch of nowhere. By the 1920s, most of it was gone. The buildings stood empty. The streets, still laid out in an optimistic grid, filled with dust. The last residents left quietly, one family at a time, until there was no one left to turn the lights off. What remains today is a scatter of ruined stone walls and broken foundations. Volunteers come periodically to stabilize what's left, but Farina barely registers on most digital platforms. No reviews, no pins. It's the kind of place that search engines don't know what to do with. What strikes you standing in those ruins is the stubbornness of the grid. The streets still run parallel. You can still see where the hotel was, where the bakery stood. The town's logic persists, even after the town itself has dissolved. Hope has a shape, and sometimes that shape outlasts everything else. Not everything that's invisible is desolate. Some of it is extraordinary. In the far northern corner of South Australia, in a region so remote that the nearest town is hours away on unsealed roads, a series of natural hot springs rise from deep underground. Dalhousie Springs. Thermal water, 38 degrees Celsius, bubbling up from an ancient aquifer that stretches across most of the continent below the surface. The springs have been there for, well, longer than anyone has been counting. Aboriginal Australians used them for thousands of years. The water supports species of fish and invertebrates that exist nowhere else on Earth. Nowhere. Not in captivity, not in any other body of water. Only here, in these warm, isolated pools at the edge of the Simpson Desert. It's one of those places that, when you describe it to someone, they assume you're talking about somewhere well known, somewhere with a visitor center and a cafe and a car park. It has none of those things. Getting there requires planning, preparation, and a vehicle that can handle days of corrugated dirt tracks. On most digital maps, Dalhousie Springs is a faint label over a pale blue shape. No photos, no reviews, no sense of what it actually is. Which means that somewhere in the Australian interior, one of the most unique ecosystems on the continent sits largely unvisited, largely unknown, thriving in its own warm silence. There's something almost relieving about that. Some places aren't so much forgotten as reduced. Madura sits on the Air Highway, roughly midway across the Nullarbor Plain, the vast, flat, almost featureless limestone plateau that stretches between South Australia and Western Australia. It was originally established as a camel breeding station in the 1870s, when camels were the only reliable way to move freight across this country. Then came roads, then trucks, then the highway, and Madura became something stranger. A service stop. A place people pass through, not a place anyone goes to. A roadhouse, a motel, a fuel pump in the middle of nothing. What most travelers don't know, because there's no reason they would, is that Madura also sits adjacent to the ruins of a Royal Australian Air Force base. During the Second World War, this was a functional military installation. Planes landed here. Personnel lived here. For a few years, this flat edge of nowhere had a kind of importance that it's never had since. The buildings are still out there. Concrete slabs, rusted metal, walls that have lost their roofs and stand open to a sky that seems too large to be real. No interpretive signs, no heritage listing that anyone can easily find. Just structures slowly going back to the earth, visible from the highway if you know to look. Most people don't look. This one requires a different kind of attention. Birindudu is a small Aboriginal community in the Northern Territory, roughly 350 kilometers southwest of Katherine. It's home to people of the Gurindji and Ngariniman nations, communities whose relationship to this land runs so deep that the word ancient barely begins to cover it. There is no sealed road to Birindudu. Access requires a permit because this is Aboriginal land. There is limited mobile coverage. There is no digital footprint in the way that most places in wealthy countries have a digital footprint. Type Birindudu into a search engine and you'll find very little, a few administrative references, a health service listing, almost nothing that speaks to what the community actually is, what the people who live there experience, what knowledge is held there. In a country where most places are catalogued, photographed, reviewed, tagged, and rated by strangers, Birindudu exists largely outside that system. Not because it isn't real, not because its residents aren't connected to the world, but because the machinery of digital visibility was never built with places like this in mind. That gap, between existing and being seen to exist, is one of the quiet ongoing realities of Indigenous Australia. It's not dramatic. It doesn't make the news. It just persists, day after day, in the form of blank spaces on platforms that weren't designed to notice. The name alone deserves a moment. Lake Disappointment. Someone sat down and wrote that on a map, and it stayed. Frank Hann, an explorer and pastoralist, was making his way across the Gibson Desert in 1897 when he noticed that all the creeks and waterways seemed to flow toward a particular point in the distance. In the logic of exploration, that meant water. A lake, perhaps a significant one. He followed the drainage. He walked towards it for days. What he found was a vast salt lake, technically water in the way that the ocean is technically drinkable. Sodium saturated, completely useless for any practical purpose, shimmering in the desert heat, like a mirage that had committed to becoming real. He named it Lake Disappointment and moved on. And the lake is roughly 330 square kilometers of salt flat, pink-tinged from halophilic bacteria, surrounded by red sand dunes. It's strangely beautiful in photographs. It's also associated with significant cultural sites of the Martu people, who have lived in this region for thousands of years, and who hold the lake within a complex web of story and lore. On a map, it gets its name, Lake Disappointment, and then not much else. The irony is that a place named after failure has more presence in the cartographic imagination than dozens of culturally significant sites nearby that appear as blank space. The European explorer's frustration became permanent. Everything else became silence. 340 kilometers. That's roughly the distance from Brisbane to Grafton or Melbourne to Shepparton. A big drive. A few hours. In most of Australia, that stretch of road would pass through several towns, petrol stations, rest stops, intersections with names. On the stretch of the air highway between Madura and Eucla, there is one point of civilization in that entire span. One. It's called Mundrabilla. It's a roadhouse. A few rooms to sleep in, a fuel bowser, and whatever food they've managed to get delivered that week. That's it. That's the entire human presence in 340 kilometers. What's interesting about Mundrabilla isn't the place itself. It's the effect it has on travelers. When you're crossing the Nullarbor and you know Mundrabilla is coming, it becomes weirdly significant. You start watching the odometer. You do the mental arithmetic. And when you see the sign, there's a disproportionate feeling of, not relief exactly, but recognition. Here is a place. Here is something that was put here deliberately. The Nullarbor does something specific to your sense of where you are. The horizon is always the same distance away. The road doesn't curve. The vegetation barely changes. After a while, you start to feel that you're not moving at all, that the landscape is just scrolling past a stationary window. Mundrabilla breaks that feeling for about 20 minutes. Then it's gone, and the Nullarbor resumes, and the horizon settles back into its permanent distance. Here is where the tone changes. Between 1956 and 1963, the British government conducted a series of nuclear weapons tests in the South Australian desert. 7 major detonations and hundreds of smaller experiments, releasing radioactive contamination across a vast stretch of land. The site was called Maralinga. The land belongs to the Maralinga Charutja people, the Anangu. They were removed from their country to allow the tests to proceed. Some were relocated to missions. Some had already been displaced by earlier colonial incursions. The full picture of who was present, who was exposed, and what they experienced in those years has never been completely documented. The British government cleaned up, partially. There were decontamination efforts in the 1960s and again in the 1990s. Plutonium was buried. The land was officially returned to the Maralinga Charutja in 2009, but parts of the site remain restricted. Contamination persists in ways that are still being monitored, and for decades, Maralinga appeared on almost no publicly available map in any useful detail. It was there, as a name sometimes, but without context, without history, without any indication of what had happened there. What happened there was this. A foreign government used another country's sacred land as a testing ground, contaminated it with radioactive material, displaced the people who lived there, and then, very slowly, very incompletely, tried to pretend it had been addressed. The invisibility of Maralinga on maps was never accidental. It was the cartographic equivalent of a door being quietly closed on something that didn't need to be discussed. That door has never been fully reopened. Wittenoom no longer exists, officially. In 2007, the Western Australian government removed Wittenoom from its official maps and road signs. The name was erased from state documents. The town was formally de-gazetted, stripped of its legal status as a place.
There's a reason. Wittenoom is contaminated with blue asbestos, Crocodylite, the most dangerous form of the mineral. For 20 years, from the 1940s to the 1960s, the Wittenoom Gorge was mined for it. Thousands of workers were exposed, residents were exposed. The dust settled on everything, got into lungs, and began doing what asbestos does, slowly, irreversibly destroying them.
The death toll from Wittenoom-related asbestos disease is in the hundreds. Some estimates put it higher. Mesothelioma, asbestosis, diseases with long latency periods that let people leave the town, build lives, have families, and then, 20 or 30 years later, understand what the dust had been doing all along. When the mine closed, Wittenoom didn't immediately empty. It became a tourist town of a kind. The gorge is genuinely beautiful, the colors extraordinary. People kept living there. Some kept living there even after the contamination was confirmed, even after the warnings, even after the government began quietly dismantling services to push people out. The last permanent residents left in the 2000s, and then the government did something unusual. It didn't just close the town, it deleted it, removed the signs, removed the name from the map, designated it an abandoned town site, and made it official policy not to acknowledge it as a place people might go to. The logic was safety. Without signage, tourists wouldn't visit and wouldn't be exposed to the dust that still sits in the soil in the gorge. There's something to that. But there's also something deeply strange about a government erasing a place from its own records, about deciding that the solution to a disaster is not to mark the disaster, but to remove the marking entirely. Wittenoom is still there. The gorge is still there. The fibers in the soil are still there. The town's shape persists in satellite imagery, streets, foundations, the ghost of a grid. It just doesn't have a name anymore. And then there is this. If you look at a map of Australian territory, there's a small speck in the Southern Ocean, roughly equidistant between Madagascar and Antarctica. It's called Heard Island. Australia has administered it since 1947. It is, technically, Australian soil. No one lives there, not seasonally, not in rotation. There is no permanent human presence on Heard Island, and there hasn't been for most of its modern history. Occasional scientific expeditions visit, sometimes years apart. There is no infrastructure, no shelter that wasn't left by a previous expedition, no communications relay, nothing. The island is 368 square kilometers of glacier, volcanic rock and Southern Ocean weather, some of the most severe weather on Earth. The volcano at its center, Mawson's Peak, is one of the most active volcanoes on the Australian continent, which is already a strange sentence, because most Australians don't think of themselves as living in a country with active volcanoes. On Google Maps, Heard Island appears as a pale shape at the edge of the frame. A few terrain lines, no roads, obviously, no landmarks. The map doesn't know what to do with it, and so it renders it as a vague outline and moves on. But what's there is not nothing. The island is home to enormous colonies of seabirds and seals. Elephant seals, fur seals, species that have never been hunted because no one has ever had sustained reason to go there. The surrounding ocean is among the most pristine marine environments on the planet, precisely because it's so unreachable. It is a place that exists entirely beyond human management, beyond human memory, in any practical sense. No one alive today has a personal relationship with Heard Island. No community holds it in their cultural memory. It was visited briefly, documented in passing, and then left to its own processes, which happen to be volcanic, glacial, and millennial in scale. The loneliest Australian territory, the most blank space on the most blank continent on Earth, a place that exists so far beyond ordinary geography that the map simply renders it in suggestion and silence. And yet the seals are there, the birds are there. The volcano is doing what it's been doing for longer than any of this has mattered. Heard Island doesn't need to be seen to exist. It just does, quietly, at the edge of everything. A blank space on a map is never just blank. It's a decision. Someone drew that map, or wrote the algorithm that renders it, and made choices, thousands of small choices, about what was worth naming and what wasn't. And those choices accumulated, over decades and centuries, into a picture of the world that feels natural now, that feels like just the way things are. But it isn't the way things are. It's the way someone decided to show them. Australia, more than anywhere, makes that visible. The sheer scale of what's been left out, the cultures, the disasters, the contaminated towns, the sacred lands, the animals living on volcanic islands at the bottom of the world, is too large to pretend away. The next time you look at a map and see empty space, it's worth sitting with that for a moment. Not with guilt, necessarily. Not with grief. Just with the understanding that the blank isn't neutral. That somewhere, on the other side of that white space, something real is happening. Something always was. The map just decided not to look.